On October 29th, 2018, domestic Lion Air Flight 610 departed from Jakarta, Indonesia, en route to Bangkok, Penang. The flight crashed into the Java Sea 13 minutes after takeoff, killing all 189 passengers and crew on board. On March 10th, 2019, International Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 departed from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, en route to Nairobi, Kenya. This flight also crashed, this time only 6 minutes after takeoff, in a nearby town of Bishoftu. All 157 passengers and crew on board were killed. The next day, China became the first country to officially ground all 737 MAX aircrafts. The European Union and United States followed over the next few days. By March 18th, all 737 MAX flights had been grounded globally. This grounding was the largest in history for any airliner. Let's rewind a bit to see what led up to all this. In 2011, American Airlines announced plans to purchase 460 airlines from rival Airbus. To win American Airlines back as a primary customer, Boeing decided to scrap plans to make a new airplane and instead improve upon the existing 737 model in order to make it more competitive with Airbus's bigger planes. This decision to extend the design rather than make a completely new plane saved Boeing time and money. This new model, called the 737 MAX, had bigger engines that were placed slightly forward and higher up on the plane's wings. This change introduced a greater risk of the airplane stalling due to it being tilted too far up. To compensate for this, Boeing added sensors called angle of attack or AOA sensors that would sense the angle of the plane and push the nose of the plane down if it sensed that the plane was tilted up too high. This whole system was called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. There are two sensors on the plane, one on each side, and at the time of the failure, these two sensors were reading different data. One of these sensors was reading a normal, safe tilt value, which was correct, while the other was reading a pitch that was way too high. The MCAS system activated despite this discrepancy and pushed the nose of the plane down. The pilots tried to counteract this, creating a sort of tug of war between the plane's computer system and the manual control of the pilots. Even though the pilots tried to disable the MCAS system, it would reactivate again after 5 seconds, and eventually each plane entered a nosedive that it was unable to recover from. There was no check to see if the two sensors were reading varying data.
Alright, so let's talk about the stakeholders. So the passengers are obviously a stakeholder in this. Passengers' families. What was that stat, Bailey?
It was estimated that Boeing lost around $10 billion in revenue due to the grounding of their 737 MAX aircrafts and also through lawsuits and payouts to family members of passengers.
Yeah, and with that loss, obviously, a stakeholder who benefits from this is their competitor Airbus. But we'll get into that duopoly, I guess, a little bit later. But obviously, one of the stakeholders that benefits.
And also, Boeing's customer airlines like Southwest, American, Boeing is sharing some of the profit losses due to the grounding of the 737 MAX. So those are stakeholders as well.
And hundreds of flights that were canceled due to these groundings as well.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, the questions that everyone was asking after these two crashes were, who's to blame? And I think on one hand, we do have Boeing. It was their fault for scrapping whatever new design they were working on and instead building off of the pre-existing 737, making it into the MAX to market it quicker, cut costs, complete with Airbus. So that's partially to blame. We also have investigations that revealed that many engineers, test pilots, and regulators were unaware that the final MCAS design only used data from one sensor instead of both. They assumed that the system would rarely, if ever, be activated. And based on these misguided assumptions, they made decisions that would prove detrimental to the stability of the aircraft. Most pilots didn't even know that the implementation of MCAS had changed until after the first crash. And in addition, there's an existing disturbing culture of denial at Boeing, where historically Boeing blames the pilots, when in reality it should be the parts that are to blame.
So Boeing, I think, is definitely to blame here for their lack of proper engineering, making sure their software was good. But also I think the FAA is in part to blame, and I think people generally agree the FAA currently has a policy where companies like Boeing can make changes to current airplane models, major changes to current airplane models, and not have pilots retrained. And in this case, Boeing modified the 737 model by making their engines significantly bigger, moving them up on the wing and moving them forward. And to prevent or to compensate for this change, Boeing also introduced this MCAS model. But because of the FAA's policy, where the pilots don't have to be retrained, pilots were unaware of this MCAS system, or thought that at the very least it would rarely be activated. And so the pilots had no idea really what was going on. They didn't understand what was triggering the MCAS system, that it was a single sensor failure, and because of their lack of training, lack of understanding of the system, you could say in part that was one of the reasons for the crash, or the crashes.
Yeah, the FAA also allows airlines to self-certify that they meet safety regulations. This is so that airlines are able to basically churn out planes quicker and not have to go through the long process of having one of their aircraft certified. And this is obviously, if these safety certifications that Boeing are doing aren't complete, which it seems like they weren't in the case of the 737 MAX, then something like this, something terrible like this can happen.
Yeah, and after we point fingers and blame and hold someone accountable, basically it's how is the compensation gonna take place? Boeing has had been charged over the course of this event $10 to $12 billion, but only 50 million of that is actually going to the families of the victims that were affected by these deadly, tragic accidents, which is pretty chump change compared to the tragedies and how big Boeing is. And then on top of that, I guess the biggest thing of what is to be done, it's looking really closely that this is kind of what happens in a duopoly, where it's just literally two players dominating the market, which is Airbus and Boeing. And you can see that even an event that's this tragic and drastic really doesn't have an effect based on Boeing's market cap and their stock price. And that's just because there's nowhere else to turn to for the market. So what do? Either government regulation or possibly funding, and enticing other competitors to come into the space, and hopefully opening up to more players in the game. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
That was a crash course on Boeing.